December 7th, 1941. Honolulu, Hawaii. The morning sun had just begun warming the Pacific waters when Lieutenant Commander Logan Mitchell stepped onto the bridge of the USS Cassin. The destroyer sat moored at Pearl Harbor's northeast lock, her crew enjoying the tranquil Sunday morning routine that had defined naval life in paradise. Mitchell sipped his coffee, noting how the harbor sparkled under the cloudless sky. By sunset, 187 American warships would crowd these waters. 21 would never sail again. 2,403 Americans would perish, and a nation determinedly neutral for 2 years would find itself irrevocably at war. 8,000 miles away in a cramped radio booth at NBC's Rockefeller Center studios, 29-year-old Robert Harrison adjusted his headphones, unaware that the next 60 minutes would transform him from an unremarkable newsreader into the voice that awakened America to war. Harrison had been selected as announcer for the weekly symphony broadcast, a prestigious, if uneventful, assignment that normally attracted an audience of refined classical music enthusiasts numbering perhaps 300,000. But within hours, his voice would reach 16 million Americans in what would become the most consequential radio broadcast of the century. The bulletin arrived at 12 minutes past 2 in the afternoon Eastern Time. Harrison glanced at the yellow paper thrust into his hands, the typewritten message so terse and shocking that he hesitated before interrupting Tchaikovsky's Piano Concerto No. 1 in B-flat minor. What happened next would fundamentally alter the relationship between American citizens, their government, and the global conflict they had desperately sought to avoid. The nation that had stubbornly maintained neutrality, despite 2 years of European bloodshed, would be unified by an invisible electronic wave that traversed living rooms, diners, and street corners with unprecedented speed, catalyzing a transformation that no newspaper headline or presidential address could have achieved. Across America, citizens went about their Sunday routines with practiced ignorance of distant conflicts. In Des Moines, Iowa, 57-year-old Margaret Calloway prepared her family's Sunday roast, the radio providing background accompaniment to domestic rituals unchanged for decades. Her 20-year-old son, James, tinkered with his Chevrolet in the driveway, his thoughts occupied by local concerns. A dance the following weekend, prospects at the insurance company where he'd recently started working, the pretty receptionist who sometimes smiled at him when he delivered mail between departments. By nightfall, he would be standing in line at a recruitment office, his mother's tears still damp on his shirt collar. At Chicago's Palmer House Hotel, visiting cattle buyer Samuel Wiseman relaxed in the lobby, the Sunday paper spread across his lap, radio music drifting from behind the reception desk. Eleanor Roosevelt had written that morning in her syndicated column, "Whatever happens, we must keep our minds and hearts focused on building a better, more peaceful country and world for ourselves and our children." Samuel had nodded approvingly when reading those words, pleased that America seemed committed to staying above the fray, engulfing Europe and Asia. In 6 hours, he would abandon his business trip, catching the first train home to Kansas City to be with his family as the nation absorbed what President Roosevelt would soon call a date which will live in infamy. The technical capabilities that made this moment possible had evolved with remarkable speed. Just 19 years earlier, KDKA in Pittsburgh had broadcast the Harding-Cox election results to perhaps a few thousand listeners. By 1941, radio had penetrated 86% of American homes, creating an invisible network binding disparate communities into a single audience that could experience events simultaneously, regardless of geography or social class. This technological achievement had transformed entertainment and advertising, but its profound political implications remained largely theoretical until that December afternoon when 16 million Americans collectively experienced the shock of sudden war through their radio speakers. 34-year-old Caroline Blackwell sat motionless in her Boston apartment, the knitting needle she had been working with now suspended in mid-air as Harrison's voice emerged from her Philco floor model radio. A schoolteacher with 2 brothers serving on American merchant vessels in the Atlantic, she had followed the European War with growing anxiety. Now, as Harrison's words filled her living room, she felt the abstract dread crystallize into concrete certainty. Her youngest brother, Daniel, whose destroyer escort had been reassigned to the Pacific just 3 months earlier, was surely in the midst of the chaos being described in these terse bulletins. The radio had collapsed 8,000 miles into nothing, bringing distant catastrophe directly into her Sunday afternoon. In Seattle's Ballard neighborhood, Norwegian immigrant Sven Johansson paused while repairing fishing nets in his garage. The radio on his workbench, normally tuned to local stations for weather reports essential to the fishing fleet, now carried Harrison's steady voice describing attacks on ships much like those Sven had served on during the Great War. The 65-year-old fisherman set down his tools and moved closer to the radio, his weathered hands trembling slightly. Though naturalized only 12 years earlier, Sven felt the peculiar transformation that the broadcast was creating across America, an instantaneous sense of shared national identity forged through electronic communication that transcended the diverse backgrounds of the listeners. At NBC headquarters, chaos had begun replacing the normal, methodical Sunday routine. News director Arthur Jensen burst into the control room, his normally immaculate appearance disheveled, a stack of wire reports clutched in his trembling hand. "Get me a line to Washington," he shouted to nobody in particular, while engineers scrambled to establish connections with affiliate stations and correspondents. The symphony broadcast continued playing, musical notes suddenly incongruous with the frantic energy building behind the scenes. In a moment that would later be recognized as pivotal in broadcast history, junior engineer Timothy Reynolds made a critical technical decision without waiting for authorization. Recognizing the unprecedented nature of the unfolding events, he bypassed standard network protocols, establishing direct connections with regional affiliates that expanded the broadcast's reach beyond its scheduled symphony audience. This improvised reconfiguration of network architecture, executed while executives were still struggling to process the incoming reports, would ultimately enable Harrison's voice to reach 16 million listeners rather than the 300,000 who normally tuned in for the Sunday concert program. Harrison watched through the glass as Jensen gesticulated wildly, assistants running between offices, telephones ringing with increasing urgency. When Jensen finally entered the booth, his face had taken on a grey pallor that made him look suddenly older. "We've just received confirmation," he said, his voice barely audible over the symphony. "The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor. Multiple ships sunk. Casualties unknown but significant. We're interrupting all programming with the bulletin as soon as you finish reading this." He thrust a hastily typed page into Harrison's hands and backed out of the booth. The 29-year-old announcer stared at the paper, mouth suddenly dry, aware of the enormity of what he was about to broadcast to a nation still wrapped in Sunday afternoon tranquility. His next words would shatter the protective psychological barrier that had allowed Americans to view the global conflict as someone else's problem. The symphony reached a natural pause, and Harrison pressed the button activating his microphone. "We interrupt this program to bring you a special news bulletin from United Press." His voice, trained for clarity rather than emotion, betrayed only the slightest tremor. "Flash, Washington. The White House announces Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor." In that moment, 16 million American radio listeners experienced identical psychological reactions despite being separated by thousands of miles. The national consciousness, which had maintained studied neutrality toward world affairs, pivoted in synchronous shock toward unified purpose. In living rooms from Maine to California, the broadcast created an unprecedented moment of collective experience. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Children were hushed. Stovetops were abandoned. The nation froze, connected by invisible electromagnetic waves carrying Harrison's measured tones. The phenomenon unfolding across America represented something unprecedented in human history. Technology enabling millions of individuals to simultaneously process identical information, creating what sociologist Emil Rauschenberg would later term electronic synchronicity. Previous generations had experienced national crises through a patchwork of delayed and localized information channels. The Civil War had reached many communities through telegraph reports read aloud in town squares days after events occurred. The Spanish-American War had been processed through competing newspaper headlines delivered at different times. But the Pearl Harbor attack entered American consciousness as a unified experience, creating a shared emotional baseline for the national response that would follow. In Philadelphia's Italian market, shoppers gathered around a radio in Dominic Salvatore's butcher shop, the normal Sunday haggling silenced as Harrison continued reading bulletins with increasing detail and urgency. The attack apparently was made on all naval and military activities on the principal island of Oahu. Among the listeners, 53-year-old Maria Constantino clutched her shopping bag, thoughts immediately turning to her 18-year-old son, Anthony, who had considered enlisting earlier that year, but decided against it, continuing his apprenticeship at the shipyard instead. By morning, he would be at the recruitment office without telling her. The butcher shop scene replicated itself in thousands of commercial establishments across America, barbershops in Harlem, diners in Kansas, hardware stores in Oregon. Places that normally functioned as segregated social spaces suddenly transformed into impromptu town halls, where racial, ethnic, and class divisions momentarily dissolved before the unifying power of electronic crisis. At Malone's barbershop in Birmingham, Alabama, the strictly enforced segregation of daily life briefly yielded to the shared experience of the broadcast, as white customers and black workers gathered around the radio in an unprecedented moment of silent equality before the news. At New York's Grand Central Terminal, the normal bustle of weekend travelers slowed to stillness around every available radio. Strangers who would normally avoid eye contact now huddled together beneath the constellations painted on the vaulted ceiling, a temporary community formed by shared crisis. Station manager William Donovan ordered all departure announcements suspended during news bulletins, an unprecedented interruption of railroad protocols that had governed the terminal for decades. Among those travelers, 23-year-old Naval Academy graduate Ensign Thomas Whitaker stood rigidly in his dress uniform, having just bid farewell to his parents after a brief weekend leave. Scheduled to report to the destroyer USS Worden in San Diego the following Friday, he listened to Harrison's increasingly detailed reports with the peculiar double awareness of someone whose personal and professional identities were simultaneously engaged. Around him, civilian travelers glanced at his uniform with new awareness, the abstract concept of Navy suddenly concrete in their midst. By midnight, Whitaker would receive telegraphed orders redirecting him to Pearl Harbor for immediate assignment, his personal connection to the event shared by 16 million fellow citizens through the technological marvel of radio. As afternoon stretched into evening, the radio broadcast evolved from terse bulletins into continuous coverage, incorporating reports from hastily awakened correspondents and government officials. NBC affiliate stations abandoned local programming, creating a unified national broadcast that reached even the most isolated communities. What had begun as a symphony interruption had become the nation's virtual town square, a forum where 16 million Americans collectively processed the transition from peace to war. In rural Georgia, the Wilkins family gathered around their recently purchased Zenith tabletop radio, its mahogany cabinet representing a significant investment for the cotton farming household. 17-year-old Elijah Wilkins, who had never traveled more than 30 miles from his birthplace, experienced through Harrison's broadcast a sudden connection to global events that previous generations of rural Americans could never have imagined. Though physically isolated on a backcountry farm, the Wilkins family participated in the national experience with the same immediacy as Manhattan apartment dwellers. The technological democracy of radio had erased traditional information hierarchies that had historically privileged urban populations. The broadcast's most consequential impact, perhaps, occurred in Washington, D.C., where it collapsed the normal bureaucratic timeline for mobilization. Secretary of War Henry Stimson had spent Sunday afternoon horseback riding at his country estate, returning to find his telephone ringing continuously with increasingly desperate calls from his office. Hearing the news on his car radio while being driven back to the Pentagon, he witnessed firsthand how the broadcast had already mobilized the public mind hours before official government machinery could respond. Within the War Department, the broadcast created an unprecedented phenomenon: junior officers making independent decisions based on shared public information rather than waiting for the traditional chain of command. Major Elliot Davidson, tasked with weekend duty at the Personnel Division, heard Harrison's broadcast on the office radio and immediately began preparing mobilization orders for reserve units without waiting for official authorization. When questioned by a superior officer, Davidson pointed to the radio. "The entire country already knows, sir. We can't be the last ones to respond. His insubordination would later be recognized as emblematic of how the broadcast had fundamentally altered the relationship between government communication and public awareness. When Stimson arrived at his office, he found something unprecedented in American military history, a department already functioning at wartime readiness because of a radio broadcast. Junior officers had taken initiative, bypassing normal channels, anticipating orders that would inevitably come. Civilians employed at the Pentagon had reported for duty without being summoned, responding to the broadcast with patriotic instinct. The normal gap between political decision and bureaucratic implementation had been collapsed by electronic media that allowed 16 million citizens to simultaneously experience a historical inflection point. Stimson's aide, Colonel Vernon Pritchard, had spent the afternoon coordinating an impromptu response center, connecting staff who arrived spontaneously after hearing the broadcast. "We're witnessing something extraordinary," he told Stimson. "The public knew and responded before we could officially tell them. Radio has changed the fundamental relationship between government and citizens." This observation captured the revolutionary nature of what was occurring. Citizens were not waiting to be informed by government, but were instead forcing government to catch up with what they already knew through commercial broadcasting. Back at NBC, Harrison continued broadcasting for 14 consecutive hours, his voice growing hoarser, but maintaining the calm authority that helped the nation process cascading developments. By 10 o'clock that evening, President Roosevelt had declared a state of war against Japan. Congress scheduled a vote for the following morning, though the actual declaration would merely formalize what had already occurred in the national consciousness through the shared experience of radio. The unprecedented length of Harrison's continuous broadcast presented technical challenges that required real-time innovation. Studio engineers improvised a relay system that allowed Harrison brief breaks while maintaining the appearance of continuous coverage. During these 5-minute intervals, Harrison would sip honey-laced tea prepared by the cafeteria staff, who had remained at their posts despite the late hour. The physical strain of sustaining broadcast voice quality for such an extended period had never been anticipated in the development of radio protocols. Even during the abdication crisis of King Edward VIII, the longest previous special broadcast, announcers had rotated hourly. Harrison's marathon performance established a new standard for crisis broadcasting that would influence industry practices for decades. In San Francisco's Chinatown, the broadcast produced more complex reactions. Community leader Thomas Wong organized an emergency meeting at the Chinese Benevolent Association, where over 400 residents gathered to hear the radio reports. Many had family in regions already suffering under Japanese occupation. The broadcast that shocked mainstream America into awareness of global conflict merely confirmed the reality they had lived with for years. Yet the community's reaction revealed another dimension of radio's unifying power. Their American identity, sometimes questioned by the larger society, found sudden affirmation in shared crisis. As Wong translated Harrison's updates for elderly members who spoke limited English, the gathered crowd displayed a complicated duality of response. Vindication that America would finally confront Japan's aggression, mixed with apprehension about how the war might affect their already precarious social position. Community elder Chen Longwei, who had immigrated 43 years earlier to help build the Transcontinental Railroad, expressed this tension. "Today, we are fully American because we share America's pain. Tomorrow, we must prove it again." His observation highlighted how the broadcast had temporarily suspended social divisions while underscoring their persistent reality. The broadcast penetrated rural America with unprecedented effectiveness. In Cades Cove, Tennessee, a mountain community with intermittent electricity, neighbors gathered at James McPherson's General Store, the only building with a reliable generator, to hear the reports. 73-year-old Civil War veteran Elijah Thornton sat motionless on the porch, listening through the open door as the younger men inside discussed what the news meant for their isolated community. When asked if this war would be different from his experience fighting at Chickamauga 78 years earlier, Thornton nodded slowly. "This one comes right into your living room," he observed, gesturing toward the radio. "No waiting for newspapers or letters. Everyone knows everything all at once." McPherson's store functioned as an impromptu community center throughout the evening, as families from outlying farms arrived by foot, horseback, and early model automobiles to gather around the radio. The station's usual evangelical programming had given way to the national NBC feed, creating a paradoxical situation where this deeply isolated Appalachian community experienced simultaneous connection to events unfolding thousands of miles away. County Extension Agent Walter Pritchard arrived at 9 that evening with enlistment information, having driven directly from Knoxville after hearing the broadcast. The 70-mile journey over mountain roads would normally represent a full day's travel, but Pritchard had driven at dangerous speeds, recognizing that even remote communities now operated on the accelerated timeline created by the broadcast. His observation captured the revolutionary nature of what was happening, not just an attack or a war declaration, but a fundamental transformation in how Americans experienced national crisis. The country had faced wars before, but never had the citizenry been unified in real-time awareness through technology that bypassed traditional information gatekeepers. The radio broadcast had accelerated psychological mobilization from what had historically taken weeks into a matter of hours. 19-year-old medical student Elizabeth Morgan sat in the University of Michigan library when a custodian interrupted the Sunday afternoon quiet by wheeling in a radio normally reserved for special events. Breaking protocol that had governed the sacred silence of academic spaces for generations, the head librarian authorized this unprecedented intrusion, recognizing that normal institutional rules had been suspended by national emergency. As Elizabeth and dozens of other students gathered around the radio, the hierarchical structure of university life temporarily dissolved. Professors, undergraduates, and staff united in shared citizenship, rather than separated by academic rank. The broadcast had suspended not just individual routines, but institutional norms, creating democratic spaces where social structures previously seemed immutable. At West Point Military Academy, the broadcast transformed Sunday afternoon leisure into focused preparation. Cadet First Class Howard Richardson had been playing chess in the recreation hall when the radio announcement interrupted a baseball game broadcast. Within 20 minutes of Harrison's first bulletin, Academy officers had implemented emergency protocols that normally required formal activation orders from Washington. The broadcast had effectively bypassed traditional military communication channels, creating a situation where the chain of command responded to publicly available information rather than official directives, an inversion of military procedure unprecedented in American history. As midnight approached on the East Coast, the continuous coverage had produced a secondary phenomenon that would prove crucial to America's war effort: a spontaneous national conversation conducted through telephone lines, neighborhood gatherings, and street corner discussions. The broadcast had created not just informed citizens, but activated participants already processing their role in the coming conflict. When factories opened Monday morning, managers found workforces already psychologically prepared for conversion to war production, having discussed it among themselves all Sunday evening. The nation's telephone infrastructure experienced unprecedented strain as Americans reached out to distant family members. New York Telephone Company reported call volume 500% above normal levels, with many circuits remaining completely saturated until the early morning hours. This secondary wave of communication represented something telecommunications engineers had never anticipated: 16 million listeners simultaneously attempting to process shared information through personal connections. The broadcast had triggered a cascading network of conversations that extended its impact exponentially beyond the original audience. In Detroit, automotive engineer Victor Klaus heard the broadcast while testing a prototype sedan on the outskirts of the city. He immediately drove to his office at the Fisher Body Plant, finding a dozen colleagues who had responded similarly. By 3 a.m, they had outlined preliminary plans for converting assembly lines to military production, hours before any official directive arrived from Washington. Similar scenes played out across America's industrial centers. Radio had compressed the normal timeline between crisis and response. At Ford's River Rouge plant, night shift supervisor Elmer Thornton arrived to find 57 workers, none scheduled for Sunday duty, already present and discussing retooling requirements for military production. Shop steward Michael Zukowski, who had rushed to the plant after hearing Harrison's broadcast at a family dinner, explained their presence simply, "We heard it together, so we came together. This isn't about contracts or schedules anymore. This spontaneous mobilization of industrial capacity would be repeated at factories nationwide, demonstrating how the broadcast had created not just emotional unity, but practical coordination independent of official directives. Even the nation's enemies recognized the broadcast's significance. In Berlin, American correspondent William Shirer, who had recently returned from reporting in Nazi Germany, received an urgent call from a former colleague still stationed in the Reich capital. German propaganda officials, his colleague reported, had been monitoring American radio broadcasts and expressed astonishment at the speed with which the medium unified public opinion. Joseph Goebbels reportedly told aides that America's radio infrastructure represented a strategic asset they had underestimated, capable of mobilizing public sentiment faster than Germany's carefully orchestrated press. Japanese officials exhibited similar concerns. Naval Intelligence Officer Commander Yasuhisa Tokugawa, assigned to the Japanese embassy in Mexico City, sent an encoded message to Tokyo noting the broadcast's unprecedented national impact. American radio has accomplished in hours what would normally require weeks of government effort. Future operations must account for this capability. This assessment acknowledged what American media theorists would later confirm. Radio had fundamentally altered the equation of modern warfare by enabling instantaneous civilian mobilization. At Pearl Harbor, the physical impact of the attack was still being assessed, as Americans on the mainland experienced it electronically. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell, who had begun his day peacefully on the USS Cassines Bridge, now worked with rescue teams pulling sailors from the harbor's oil-slicked waters. The destroyer he had commanded lay capsized against her mooring, a total loss. Mitchell had no way of knowing that his personal tragedy was simultaneously entering the consciousness of 16 million fellow citizens through Robert Harrison's steady voice. The radio announcer could never have anticipated how his broadcast was unfolding across the nation. As he read increasingly detailed bulletins, Harrison maintained the measured cadence that had become a psychological anchor for listeners. Studio executives made the unprecedented decision to suspend commercial breaks entirely, recognizing that normal broadcasting conventions had been rendered irrelevant by historical circumstances. When a sponsor called to protest the preemption of a scheduled advertisement, NBC President Niles Trammell reportedly responded, "Your commercial will air when the war is over." Navy Nurse Lieutenant Evelyn Pierce worked frantically at the Pearl Harbor Naval Hospital, triaging wounded sailors as they arrived by the dozens. 24 hours into her shift, she paused in the supply room, overhearing a radio playing in an adjacent office. Harrison's voice described casualties and damage with a precision that struck her as surreal. How could someone thousands of miles away articulate what she was witnessing firsthand? The broadcast created an eerie parallel reality where her immediate traumatic experience was simultaneously being processed by millions of distant listeners, collapsing the normal distinction between direct witness and informed observer. In the NBC studio, Harrison finally relinquished the microphone at 4:30 Monday morning, his voice reduced to a raspy whisper after 14 hours of continuous broadcasting. He stumbled into the hallway, where news director Jensen gripped his shoulder. "You just changed history," Jensen said simply. Harrison shook his head, too exhausted for philosophical reflection. "I just read what came over the wire," he replied. But he had done much more. The broadcast had compressed America's psychological journey from neutrality to war into hours rather than weeks or months. When citizens arrived at work Monday morning, they did so not as individuals processing a newspaper headline, but as participants in a shared national experience, having already discussed implications with family and neighbors throughout Sunday evening. The broadcast had created what sociologists would later identify as electronic nationhood, a unified consciousness that transcended traditional barriers of geography, class, and ethnicity. Harrison's technical performance had itself set new standards for broadcasting during crisis. His pacing, tone modulation, and ability to read raw bulletins without editorial commentary established a template that would influence generations of broadcast journalists. CBS News Director Edward R. Murrow, who had been traveling in the Midwest when the attack occurred, later praised Harrison's remarkable restraint that allowed facts rather than emotion to drive the national response. This approach contrasted sharply with the sensationalism that had characterized yellow journalism during previous conflicts, demonstrating radio's capacity to inform without inflaming. As dawn broke over American cities on December 8th, recruitment offices already had lines stretching around blocks. Factory workers arrived for shifts discussing conversion to war production before management had formulated plans. Bond salesmen reported unprecedented interest from citizens looking to support war financing. The broadcast had not merely informed Americans about an attack, it had catalyzed a nationwide mobilization of industrial, financial, and human resources at a speed that astounded military planners. At the Brooklyn Navy Yard, Monday morning shift workers arrived to find hundreds of their colleagues already present, despite not being scheduled. Machinist Thomas Donahue had been listening to Harrison's broadcast with his family in Queens when he decided to take the subway directly to work rather than waiting for his Tuesday shift. "We all heard the same news," he explained to his supervisor. "Why would we wait for someone to tell us what we already know needs doing?" This sentiment captured how the broadcast had altered the traditional relationship between authority and action. 16 million listeners had been unified not just in awareness, but in purpose. In Chicago, cattle buyer Samuel Wiseman never completed his business trip. Instead, he joined 5 million other Americans who adjusted travel plans in response to the broadcast, creating the largest spontaneous population movement since the Civil War as citizens sought to reconnect with families. The nation's railroad and bus systems reported 100% capacity by Monday afternoon, with station managers improvising additional services to accommodate the surge. This mass movement represented another unexpected consequence of the broadcast, people responding not just intellectually but physically to shared information. Transportation historian Caroline Ferguson would later identify this as the first information-driven migration, where millions of individuals made identical travel decisions based on electronic reporting rather than direct experience. The phenomenon demonstrated how radio had fundamentally altered not just how Americans processed news, but how they physically responded to it. By Tuesday morning, when Congress officially declared war, the action merely formalized what had already occurred in the national consciousness. 16 million radio listeners had experienced a collective transformation through Harrison's broadcast, fundamentally altering the relationship between media, citizenship, and national purpose. The Japanese attack had struck America's Pacific Fleet, but the radio broadcast had mobilized its most powerful resource, a unified citizenry psychologically prepared for the sacrifices ahead. In the years that followed, media theorists and military historians would study December 7th as the first electronic Pearl Harbor, a watershed moment when broadcast technology demonstrated its capacity to collapse the normal timeline between crisis and response. The radio broadcast had accelerated America's war mobilization by weeks, perhaps months, creating unified purpose overnight among a population previously divided on international engagement. At the University of Chicago, communications researcher Harold Laswell began documenting what he termed the cascade effect of the broadcast, how Harrison's voice had triggered not just individual responses, but network reactions that amplified the impact exponentially. The 16 million initial listeners had become nodes in countless conversation networks, extending the broadcast's reach to virtually the entire population within 24 hours. This phenomenon established new parameters for understanding mass communication in democratic societies, suggesting that electronic media could function not just as information channels, but as catalysts for coordinated social action. Robert Harrison never again experienced such a pivotal role in history. He continued as an NBC announcer through the war years, eventually transitioning to television in the 1950s. When interviewed for the network's 20th anniversary broadcast in 1961, he downplayed his contribution with characteristic modesty. "I was just the messenger," he insisted. "It was the medium that made the difference." Yet his voice had become inextricably linked with America's entry into World War. the conduit through which 16 million citizens simultaneously experienced national transformation. The broadcast had demonstrated that modern warfare encompassed not just military engagements, but the instantaneous psychological mobilization of entire populations. America's enemies had unleashed their aircraft over Pearl Harbor, but America had responded with an invisible electronic counterattack that unified its citizens with unprecedented speed and effectiveness. Media historian Catherine Winfield noted that Harrison represented a new archetypal figure in American society, the broadcaster whose voice created shared national experience. Previous generations had gathered around orators, ministers, or newspaper editors who interpreted events through regional or ideological lenses. The radio announcer, by contrast, spoke simultaneously to millions without intermediaries, creating what Winfield termed voice authority that transcended traditional social hierarchies. Harrison's broadcast had demonstrated how this technological voice could mobilize a democratic society with efficiency that authoritarian systems found difficult to comprehend. By Christmas 1941, American industrial conversion to war production was proceeding at a pace that military planners had estimated would require until March. Recruitment had exceeded quarterly projections within 2 weeks. War bond sales had reached targets set for the entire first quarter. The broadcast had compressed the normal timeline of national mobilization, creating what President Roosevelt called the great arsenal of democracy weeks ahead of schedule. The accelerated mobilization manifested in countless individual decisions triggered by Harrison's voice. In Wichita, Kansas, aircraft manufacturer Walter Beech heard the broadcast while driving home from church. By Monday morning, he had assembled his engineering team and begun redesigning production lines for military aircraft, implementing conversion plans that government authorities had expected would require months of negotiation and planning. Similar initiative appeared across industrial sectors. Harrison's broadcast had effectively deputized 16 million listeners as self-directed participants in war mobilization. In his fireside chat on December 9th, Roosevelt acknowledged the broadcast's role without explicitly naming it. "We have known for many years that modern warfare requires more than soldiers and sailors," he told the nation. "It requires unity of purpose, achieved with unprecedented speed." The president understood what media scholars would later confirm. His radio address reached a nation already psychologically mobilized by the broadcast 2 days earlier. Roosevelt's communication team recognized that Harrison's marathon broadcast had fundamentally altered the media landscape. Presidential speechwriter Robert Sherwood observed that the initial broadcast had created an attentive national audience unlike anything previously experienced. "The president isn't informing Americans about Pearl Harbor," he noted during preparations for the fireside chat. "He's responding to an America already transformed by what they heard on Sunday." This recognition influenced both the content and tone of Roosevelt's address, acknowledging that electronic media had created a new relationship between leadership and citizenry in democratic societies. Margaret Calloway in Des Moines received her first letter from son James in February 1942. He was training at Fort Benning, Georgia, having enlisted on December 8th. "Everything happened so fast after we heard the news on the radio," he wrote. "One minute I was working on the Chevy, the next I was signing enlistment papers. But I wasn't alone, Mom. When I got to the recruitment office, it seemed like every young man in Iowa was there too. We all heard the same broadcast. We all made the same decision." His observation captured the essence of what had occurred, a technological achievement that transformed 16 million individual listeners into a unified nation with shared purpose. The broadcast that began with Robert Harrison interrupting Tchaikovsky had culminated in the most rapid mobilization of resources, industry, and manpower in American history. The broadcast's long-term impact extended beyond immediate mobilization into the very structure of American civic identity. Communications scholar Dennis Ferguson identified Pearl Harbor as the moment when radio transformed from entertainment medium to essential civic infrastructure, establishing patterns of media consumption that would define American democracy throughout the 20th century. The 16 million listeners who experienced war through Harrison's voice established new expectations about how citizens should receive critical information, directly, simultaneously, and without geographic privilege. By the time Allied forces achieved victory in 1945, the role of radio in America's war effort had been largely overshadowed by military accomplishments and industrial production statistics. Yet historians increasingly recognize December 7, 1941, not just as the date of Japan's attack, but as the moment when electronic media demonstrated its capacity to unify national consciousness with unprecedented speed and effectiveness. The broadcast's legacy manifested in post-war media development. When television emerged as the dominant electronic medium in the 1950s, its operational protocols for crisis coverage derived directly from what NBC had improvised during Harrison's marathon broadcast. The concepts of breaking news, continuous coverage, and the suspension of commercial programming during national emergencies all trace their origins to decisions made in the chaotic hours following Pearl Harbor. Harrison's performance established expectations about how broadcast journalists should function during crisis, providing factual information with minimal editorial interpretation while maintaining the calm authority that had helped 16 million Americans process shocking developments. The 16 million Americans who experienced war through Harrison's broadcast had participated in a technological revolution as consequential as any weapon developed during the conflict. Pearl Harbor had awakened America to external threats, but the radio broadcast had awakened it to its own capacity for unified purpose, a lesson that would shape the nation's self-perception throughout the remaining century. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell never returned to the USS Cassin. After supervising recovery operations at Pearl Harbor, he was reassigned to the Atlantic Fleet, eventually commanding the destroyer USS Corrie during the Normandy landings. When interviewed for a naval history project in 1976, he reflected on the strange duality of December 7th, experiencing the attack firsthand, while the nation experienced it through radio. "We were isolated in the immediate chaos," he recalled, while Americans on the mainland were more unified in their understanding of what was happening than we were. That was the power of radio. It created a shared experience that transcended geography. During the Normandy operation, Mitchell found himself on the opposite side of this technological equation. His crew gathered around the ship's radio to hear reports about the invasion they were actively participating in. This paradoxical situation, where combatants received contextualized understanding of their own experience through broadcast media, illustrated how thoroughly electronic communication had transformed the relationship between event and perception. Mitchell noted the strange comfort his sailors derived from hearing their own battle described to the nation, as if the broadcast validated their individual sacrifices by integrating them into collective understanding. His observation identified the profound paradox of that day. Those physically present at the attack experienced it as individuals, while those thousands of miles away experienced it as a unified nation through Harrison's broadcast. Technology had inverted the normal relationship between proximity and understanding, allowing 16 million distant listeners to comprehend the national significance more immediately than those witnessing the actual explosions. This inversion would become increasingly common in subsequent conflicts, the individual soldier's limited tactical perspective contrasting with the strategic overview available to distant civilians through electronic media. Military sociologist Richard Thornton identified this as a fundamental transformation in the psychology of modern warfare. Electronic media created a new relationship between combatant and citizen, where those in direct danger often had less contextual understanding than those safely distant but connected through broadcast. This phenomenon, first manifested during the Pearl Harbor broadcast, would reach its apotheosis during the Vietnam War, when television brought combat into American living rooms with even greater immediacy than Harrison's radio bulletins. As the last survivors of Pearl Harbor fade into history, the dual nature of December 7th, 1941 endures, remembered both as a military attack and as the moment when electronic media demonstrated its capacity to transform individual citizens into a unified nation overnight. The Japanese strike had lasted less than 2 hours, but the broadcast that carried news of it to 16 million Americans had launched a revolution in how citizens experience national crisis, a revolution that continues to shape how we understand our shared destiny in moments of challenge and triumph. The broadcast's ultimate legacy extends beyond its immediate historical context into fundamental questions about technology's role in democratic societies. The 16 million Americans who gathered around radios that December afternoon participated in a transformation that transcended the specific crisis. They experienced the birth of electronic citizenship, where shared information creates shared purpose with unprecedented speed and scale. Harrison's voice, transmitted through an invisible network of electromagnetic waves, demonstrated that modern democracy requires not just informed citizens, but connected ones, capable of responding to national challenges with unified resolve made possible through technology that collapses distance and difference into common cause.